$100 tip. That is all he was worth now. The man who once lit cigars with $100 bills was now being handed one as charity by the husband of the woman he threw away like garbage. 3 years ago, Brian Thorne stood at the top of the world. Billionaire, tech genius, king of Manhattan. He kicked his pregnant wife out into the rain at 11 p.m. because he thought she was holding him back from greatness. He never imagined that same woman would return, glowing in emerald silk, holding the hand of the most powerful man in his industry, carrying a child that would inherit 2 massive fortunes, while Brian would be parking cars in the freezing Chicago snow, invisible to everyone who once feared his name. But here's the twist that will make your jaw drop. The billion-dollar empire Brian built, it was never actually his. And the moment his ex-wife decided to flip one switch, everything he ever owned simply vanished. This is not just a satisfying revenge story. This is a masterclass in how the universe collects its debts. Because what Brian did to Emma in that rainy night, the payback came with compound interest. And if you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or thrown away by someone who thought you were worthless, this story will feel like justice served ice cold. Stay until the very end, because the final scene, when Brian comes face to face with everything he lost, will hit you harder than you expect. This story will remind you of one powerful truth. The people you step on while climbing to the top are the same people you will meet on your way back down. And sometimes the person you underestimated the most becomes the architect of your complete destruction. The light fixtures at Lorne were not made of ordinary glass. They were supposedly crafted from diamonds. At least, that was the story Brian Thorne enjoyed telling people. It supported the image he had built for himself. He was the man who could spin straw into gold, the tech genius who climbed from the tough Chicago streets to the luxury penthouses of Manhattan. That evening, Brian was seated at the most coveted table in the restaurant, the one typically held for visiting dignitaries and celebrities. Seated across from him was Chloe, a 23-year-old model whose stunning looks were matched only by her inability to hold a meaningful conversation. She was busy browsing Instagram, her perfectly painted thumbnail pausing on pictures of herself. "Put your phone away, Chloe," Brian said, his voice quiet but firm. "We are supposed to be celebrating. The merger with Concade Logistics is complete. I am now the official majority shareholder." Chloe glanced up, her blue eyes wide but empty. "Oh, right. That's great, honey. Does this mean we can finally get that villa in Como, the one with the private boat dock?" Brian slowly swirled the vintage Pinot Noir in his glass, feeling that old, familiar sense of emptiness in his chest. It was the feeling of being utterly bored. "We can buy the entire lake if we want to," he mumbled, but the words no longer gave him any pleasure. 6 months. It had been that long since his divorce from Emma. The name, Emma, still felt like ashes on his tongue. She was his sweetheart from college, the woman who had mended his socks back when he was too broke to buy new ones, the one who would stay awake all night to review his very first business proposals. But as the numbers in Brian's bank account swelled, Emma stayed the same simple person. She preferred quiet evenings at home. She chose comfortable shoes over designer heels. She had no idea how to flatter investors or take command of a boardroom. Brian had talked himself into believing that he had simply outgrown her. He needed a trophy on his arm, not a life partner. So, he ended things in the cruelest way possible. He could still see that day with perfect clarity. He had given her the divorce papers along with a check, explaining that she no longer fit into his future plans. She didn't yell. She didn't break a single thing. She just looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound and heartbreaking sadness, and quietly said, "You will discover the cost of this, Brian," before turning and walking out into the pouring rain. "Brian, you're zoning out," Chloe complained, tapping her fork on her wine glass. "I've ordered the lobster, but our waiter is completely ignoring me." "He is not ignoring you. He is just busy," Brian replied sharply, his patience wearing thin. All at once, the background noise of the restaurant, the soft jazz music, the low hum of conversations, the clatter of silverware faded away. It was not a gradual quieting. It was a sudden, unified hush. Brian scowled. Lorne was a place where celebrities came and went every day. A silence like this meant that someone with true influence had just entered. "Who is that?" Chloe asked, stretching her neck to see. "Is that a movie star?" Brian shifted in his seat to get a better view of the main entrance. The host, a man named Pierre, who normally acted superior to everyone, was now bowing so low he was nearly bent in half. Two people entered, escorted by 4 security guards who moved with the quiet efficiency of professional soldiers. The man was tall, easily over 6'2", and wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that likely cost more than Brian's first car. He had hair that was a mix of silver and black, and a strong jaw that looked like it was cut from stone. Brian went completely still. He recognized that man. Everyone in his world recognized him. It was Adrian Vance, the chief executive officer of Vance Global, the man who controlled the shipping companies Brian relied on, the satellites Brian leased, and the banks that loaned Brian money. Adrian Vance came from old, powerful money. He was a predator that other predators knew to avoid. But it was not Adrian who made all the color drain from Brian's face. It was the woman on Adrian's arm. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown of emerald green silk that hugged her figure before pooling elegantly at her feet. Her hair, which she used to pull back into a simple bun, now flowed down her back in shimmering, perfect waves. Around her neck was a sapphire necklace that sparkled in the light, glowing like a blue flame. It was Emma, but not the Emma he remembered. The quiet, timid woman was gone. This woman held her head high, her eyes scanning the room with a calm and almost frightening self-assurance. And then Brian saw it. The silk dress had been perfectly altered to make room for the very obvious, round curve of her belly. She was very pregnant. Brian's hand clenched around his wine glass so tightly that the stem snapped in two. Red wine flooded the crisp white tablecloth, looking unsettlingly like a pool of blood. "Oh my goodness, Brian, see what you did," Chloe cried out, leaping back to keep the wine from splashing on her. Brian did not hear her. He could not hear anything over the sound of blood pounding in his ears. Pregnant? She had to be at least 7 months along. He did the calculation in his head instantly. 6 months had passed since the divorce. 7 months pregnant. The entire room started to spin. Was the baby his, or had she found someone new that fast? As the host guided Adrian and Emma across the restaurant, their path took them right past Brian's table. Brian felt frozen in place, unable to tear his eyes away. He half expected Emma to flinch, to look at the floor, to try and hide. But as they drew closer, Emma's gaze met his directly. There was no trace of fear in her eyes. There was no trace of love. Love either. There was just a cold, smooth indifference, the way you would look at a random person on the street. Adrian Vance gently placed a hand on the small of Emma's back and leaned down to say something close to her ear. Emma laughed, a bright melodic sound that Brian had not heard from her in years. They swept by his table, leaving behind a faint trail of jasmine and expensive cologne. Wait a minute, Chloe whispered, her eyes narrowing in thought. Isn't that your ex-wife, the plain one? Brian stared at the red stains spreading across the tablecloth. Yes, he said, his voice so hoarse it sounded like a stranger's. That's Emma. A waiter hurried to their table to clean up the mess, apologizing over and over, as if it was his fault that Brian had lost control. Brian irritably waved him off, his hunger having vanished completely. I just don't understand, Chloe said, nibbling on a piece of bread. You told me she was broke. You told me she was a nobody. So why is she with him? That's Adrian Vance. My father says Adrian Vance could probably buy this whole city if he felt like it. I do not know, Chloe, Brian snapped, loud enough for a neighboring table to turn and look. He lowered his voice, balling his hands into fists beneath the table. I do not know. On the other side of the room, Adrian and Emma were being shown to a private corner table, the very one that even Brian was never able to reserve. It had a sweeping view of the city lights, yet was secluded enough for complete privacy. Brian couldn't stop watching them. He watched Adrian gently pull out Emma's chair for her. He saw how the restaurant staff swarmed around them, treating Emma as if she were royalty. But the thing that truly tormented him was the way Adrian was looking at her. It was not the look a man gives a pretty accessory. It was a look of pure, unadulterated adoration, and the way his hand came to rest on her belly as he took his seat. The way the man touched her looked like he owned her. A gesture that was both protective and fatherly. Brian's thoughts began to spiral. Could that be his son? It felt impossible. They had only been together 7 months ago, which meant the baby had to be his. Yet she had never said a word to him. A wave of indignation washed over him. If that child was his direct heir, he deserved to be told. He was Brian Thorne, and people did not keep secrets from him. Brian pushed his chair back and lied. I need to use the restroom. Chloe pouted. Do not be long. I still want to get dessert. Brian paid her no attention as he crossed the main dining area. He bypassed the restroom completely and headed straight for the private alcove. His heart was pounding against his chest, driven by a confusing mix of fury and an unexpected, sharp sense of desperation. As he got closer, 2 imposing men in suits emerged from the dim light, blocking his way. Brian tried to put on his commanding CEO voice and said, "Let me pass. I know him." One of the bodyguards replied in a flat, uninterested tone, "Mr. Vance is not seeing anyone at the moment." "Let him come through, Marcus." A deep voice carried over from the table. The 2 guards stepped apart. Brian entered the secluded space. Emma did not even bother to look up from her menu. She was glowing, her skin radiant from her pregnancy, her cheeks slightly flushed. She looked healthier and more stunning than she ever had in all their years of marriage. "Emma," Brian said, his voice strained. She deliberately lowered the menu. Her hazel eyes, now cool and distant, met his. "Hello, Brian. I was wondering how long it would take you to come marching over here." "You are pregnant," he said, stating the obvious. Sharp as ever, she shot back, her voice full of sarcasm. "Is it... Evish?" Brian glanced over at Adrian, who was observing him with a smirk of predatory amusement while sipping his scotch. Brian's eyes went back to Emma's stomach. "Is it mine?" Emma gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Yours, Brian? You surrendered any right to ask that question on the night you kicked me out of our house at 11 p.m. because you said I lacked ambition. If that is my child, I have rights," Brian hissed, taking a step forward. "I have lawyers who can—" "Sit down, boy," Adrian Vance said. He did not raise his voice. He did not even get up. He simply spoke, and the raw power in his voice was so complete that Brian froze where he stood. "Mr. Thorne," Adrian went on, swirling the ice in his glass, You seem to be operating under several wrong assumptions. Allow me to correct them. First, you will not raise your voice to my fiancé. It is not good for the baby. Fiancé? The word struck Brian with the force of a physical punch. Second, Adrian said, his eyes model becoming as cold as ice. As for the baby, you are far too preoccupied with your, what is she? Some Instagram model. You spent the last year of your marriage chasing after her, so you rarely even touched your wife. We both know how things really were, Brian, so do not embarrass yourself by pretending you were an attentive husband. Brian's face turned a deep shade of red. He looked over at Emma, desperately looking for any sign of weakness. Emma, tell him. Tell him who I am. I already told him who you were, Brian, Emma replied gently. She rested a hand on her stomach. I told him you were the man who tore me down just so you could feel powerful. I told him you were the man who convinced me I was worthless. She reached over and held Adrian's hand, and then Adrian helped me see that I am invaluable. You are only with him for his money, Brian spat. His pride completely shattered. That is all it is it not? You simply traded a millionaire for a billionaire. You are nothing but a gold digger, Emma. The temperature in their little corner seemed to drop 10 degrees. Adrian placed his glass on the table. The sound it made was quiet, but it rang out like a gunshot. Be very careful, Adrian whispered. You are talking to the chairwoman of the Vance Foundation, and she is not like you, Brian. She did not inherit her position or steal it. She rebuilt her life from the wreckage you left behind. Just then, Chloe, who had lost her patience, came clicking over to the table in her high heels. She glanced between the three of them, feeling the tension but not being smart enough to understand the situation. Babe, what is the holdup? Chloe whined, clinging to Brian's arm. Her eyes landed on Emma, and she sneered. Oh, it is you. Wow, you have really packed on the pounds. I guess the divorce has not been kind to you. The silence that came after her words was absolute. Emma did not react with anger. She just smiled, a slow smile filled with pity. And you must be Chloe. Brian always did like shiny objects that lack any real substance. Chloe gasped. Excuse me? You can have him, Emma said, turning her attention back to the menu. I have already thrown him away. But I will give you a piece of advice, my dear. You should check the prenuptial agreement. Brian is extremely protective of every last penny. Adrian let out a dark chuckle. Marcus, get them out of my sight. They are ruining my dinner. The security guard, a massive and imposing figure, stepped forward. This is not finished, Emma, Brian snarled, as the guards led him away. You cannot keep my child from me. I will crush you in court. Adrian Vance rose to his feet. He seemed to tower over Brian. He leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous growl next to Brian's ear. If you dare to sue her, if you try to bother her, or if you so much as glance in her direction again, I will not just sue you, Brian. I will buy your company, sell it for parts, and you will have nothing left except that cheap suit you are wearing. Do not try me. Brian backed away. He had no other option. He returned to his table, with Chloe chattering in his ear about how disrespectful they were. But Brian was not listening. He sat down, staring at the empty seat where his future was supposed to be. He looked at Emma, who was laughing with a billionaire and carrying a child who might inherit 2 massive fortunes. And for the very first time in his life, Brian Thorne felt utterly insignificant. But the evening was a long way from being over. As Brian motioned for the bill, eager to leave, he noticed a man in a gray suit walking toward Adrian's table. It was a process server. Brian froze. Was Adrian getting sued? No. The man continued past Adrian and walked directly to Brian's table. "Brian Thorne?" the man inquired. "Yes, you have been served," the man stated, setting a thick envelope down on the table, right beside the wine stain. Brian ripped it open, his hands trembling. It was not a lawsuit from Adrian. It was a lawsuit from Emma. Plaintiff, Emma Vance Cross. The subject was the theft of intellectual property related to the Thorne algorithmic model. Brian felt a chill run down his spine. The algorithm, the very code that had earned him his first billion. The code he had always claimed to have written, but was actually written by Emma in their college dorm room 10 years ago. She was not just seeking revenge. She was here to take back everything. The morning light streamed through the glass walls of Brian Thorne's corner office, but it provided no comfort. The air in the room was icy, cooled to a sterile temperature that mirrored the tense atmosphere around the mahogany conference table. Brian sat with his face buried in his hands. Across from him sat Marcus Sterling, his top lawyer, a man who typically charged $500 an hour to look uninterested. But today, he looked truly terrified. "Tell me this is some kind of a prank, Sterling," Brian mumbled, pushing the lawsuit across the table. She was a literature major. She would proofread my emails. She did not write the actual code. Sterling took off his glasses, and a bead of sweat ran down his forehead. "Brian, our forensic IT team analyzed the source code of the Thorne algorithmic model, which is the foundation of your entire company. They discovered something hidden deep within the kernel, some hidden metadata. And," Brian demanded. Sterling pressed a key on his laptop, and an image appeared on the wall screen. It displayed a complex line of code, but tucked within the programming were comments, notes left by the programmer for Brian. "So you can finally get some sleep tonight, love, E." Brian stared at the screen. The memory hit him with the force of a punch. It had been 7 years ago. He was on the brink of failing his final exams, and his code kept crashing every time he tried to run it. He had fallen asleep on their futon, completely exhausted. When he woke up, the code was working perfectly. Emma was sitting there with a cup of coffee, offering him a tired smile. She mentioned that she had fiddled with it. He had just thought she corrected a typo. He never imagined that she had completely restructured the entire architecture. "It gets even worse," Sterling said, his voice becoming quieter. "The lawsuit states that the copyright for this particular architecture was registered by her using a pseudonym, Ghostwriter, 3 days before you launched the company. She is the legal owner of the intellectual property, Brian, and she is now filing for an immediate injunction to have your servers shut down until a financial agreement is made." "Shut us down?" Brian jumped to his feet, sending his chair flying backward. "If our servers are down for even an hour, our stock will drop by 10%. If they are shut down for an extended period, Thorntech will be bankrupt in less than a week. In that case, you have to settle," Sterling said, with a grim expression. "Offer her anything she desires: money, company shares, an apology. Because if this case goes to court, she has all the digital evidence, and she has Adrian Vance's legal team supporting her. They will destroy us." Brian walked over to the window and looked out at the city he once believed he controlled. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. "Babe, my credit card was just declined at Gucci. You need to fix it immediately. People are looking at me." Brian threw his phone against the wall, and it shattered into pieces. He could not lose his company. He was Brian Thorne. He was a genius. He was not a fake who had built his success on his wife's hard work. "Where is she?" Brian demanded. Turning back to Sterling. "She is hosting the Silver Gala at the Metropolitan Museum tonight," Sterling answered. "It is a charity event for single mothers. Tickets cost $20,000 each. Get me a ticket, Brian commanded. Brian, if you go near her, you will be violating the restraining order. I said, get me a ticket, Brian shouted. I am not going to bother her. I am just going to make her remember that she loved me at one time. Emma is a sensitive person. She is emotional. If I can just manage to get her by herself, away from Vance, I can persuade her to reconsider. I can convince her to drop all of this. Sterling appeared unconvinced, but he took out his phone. I will see what I can do, but Brian, she does not seem very sensitive anymore. The Metropolitan Museum had been turned into a stunning, glittering wonderland of silver and white. The city's most powerful people, including politicians, wealthy heirs, and tech billionaires, moved through the grand halls, holding champagne glasses. Brian arrived by himself. He had not brought Chloe. He wanted to look serious and regretful. He was dressed in his most formal suit, yet he felt like a fraud who did not belong. Every hushed conversation he overheard seemed to be about him. Did you hear about the drop in Thorntech's stock today? I heard Vance Global is buying a huge share in a new competing company. Brian pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes searching for an emerald green dress. But tonight, he did not see green. He saw silver. Emma was standing on a raised stage near the Temple of Dender, speaking into a microphone. She was wearing a silver maternity dress that shimmered like liquid moonlight. She appeared regal and untouchable, like a queen addressing her people. And that is why the Vance Foundation is committing $50 million to provide legal assistance for women who have been unfairly deprived of their assets in divorce cases, Emma announced, her voice confident and clear. The audience burst into applause. Brian felt a wave of nausea in his stomach. The fund was a clear and direct attack on him. As Emma came down from the stage, surrounded by people congratulating her, Brian made his move. He worked his way through the crowd, ignoring the angry looks from people he had previously ignored. Emma, he called out, just as her security was about to lead her away. She paused. The crowd around them made space, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. It was the confrontation that everyone had been gossiping about. Emma turned around slowly. For once, Adrian was not right beside her. He was across the room talking with a senator. This was Brian's opportunity. Brian, she said, her face revealing no emotion. You purchased a ticket. That is very generous of you. I will assume the sum $20,000 is a first payment on the alimony you have yet to pay me. The mention of alimony caused a few people nearby to laugh. Brian moved closer, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Emma, please, we have to speak in private. I have nothing to tell you that I cannot also say in front of a judge, she responded coldly. This is about the company, Brian pleaded. You are going to ruin it. Do you realize how many people are going to lose their jobs? I understand you are angry with me, but do not punish my employees for it. That is not the person you are. You are a kind person. You are the woman who rescues stray cats. Emma's eyes flashed with anger. The woman who saved stray cats died the night she was forced to sleep in her car because her husband had canceled all of her credit cards. The crowd let out a collective gasp. The color drained from Brian's face. That was a secret he hoped would stay buried. I did not know you had nowhere else to go, he sputtered. I assumed you went to your parents' house. My parents are gone, Brian. You knew that perfectly well. You simply chose to ignore it. She moved closer, her voice sinking to a dangerous whisper. And this company is not your company. It was built on my programming, my sleepless nights, and my talent. You were just the handsome face, Brian, and I'm about to rip that mask off. Emma, please wait, Brian pleaded, reaching for her. What about the baby? If you take me down, you take down his inheritance with me. That baby is mine, isn't it? You know, deep down, that he needs his father. Emma's eyes glanced at Brian's hand on her arm, then slowly traveled back to his face. She made no move to pull away. A smile touched her lips, but it was cold as ice. "You want to discuss the baby, Brian?" "Yes," he breathed, sensing he had found a weak spot. "I have a right to know." "Fine," she announced, her voice carrying to the people standing nearby. "The night you threw me out, I was holding a gift box. Do you recall that?" Brian's brow furrowed as he thought back. Yes, he remembered a small white box. He had swatted it from her grasp in his hurry to push her out the door so Chloe could come inside. "I remember," he whispered. Inside that box, Emma said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage, was a positive pregnancy test and a pair of tiny baby shoes. "I was trying to tell you." "I was trying to say, Brian, we were going to be a family, and you just looked at me and said, 'Get your junk and get out.'" Brian felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. The room started to spin. "So do not stand here and act like you suddenly care about being a father," Emma hissed. "You abandoned your own child before he was even born, but he has a father now. A real man who held me when I cried, who attended every single ultrasound, who built the nursery with his own 2 hands. That is not the same," Brian argued feebly. "Biology is important. Biology makes you a sperm donor, Brian. Love is what makes a father." At that moment, a heavy hand clamped down on Brian's shoulder. It was Adrian Vance. He had crossed the room in an instant. "Is there a problem?" Adrian asked. His voice was calm but had a terrifying depth. "We are just talking," Brian said, attempting to shrug the hand away. He could not. Adrian's grip was like a vice to... "It looked like you were bothering my wife," Adrian said. "She is not your wife yet," Brian spat out, his jealousy flaring. Adrian smiled. He pulled a folded document from his pocket and tucked it into Brian's breast pocket. "Read that after you leave. It is a copy of the official adoption. I legally adopted the child in utero 2 weeks ago, with Emma's complete consent and the court's full approval, based on proven abandonment by the biological father." Brian just stared at him, his mouth hanging open. You cannot do that." "I am Adrian Vance," he said plainly. "I can do anything. Now get out of my building before I have security throw you down the steps." Utterly humiliated and defeated, with the eyes of New York's most powerful people burning into his back, Brian turned and ran. He stumbled out into the cool night air of Central Park. He reached into his pocket and took out the paper Adrian had handed him. It was more than just adoption papers. Attached to the back was a DNA test result. Subject: Brian Thorne. Result: 0% probability of paternity. Brian froze solid. He read it one more time. 0%. He frantically looked over the document. Then his eyes caught the medical note at the very bottom. The subject has a congenital condition that renders him sterile. This condition has likely been present since adolescence. Brian dropped the paper onto the sidewalk. He was not the father. He had never been the father. It was impossible for him to be a father. But if he was sterile and Emma was pregnant, then who was the father? That is when the pieces clicked into place. The timing. The business trip Emma had taken by herself a year ago to the West Coast, where Vance Global's headquarters was located. She had not met Adrian just 6 months ago. She had known him before that. The rain in New York never washes anything clean. It just makes the grime slicker. Brian was standing on the sidewalk outside a specialized fertility clinic on the Upper East Side, and the heavy oak door shut behind him with a finality that shook him to his core. He had barged in there demanding answers, threatening to sue for malpractice, and screaming that the DNA test from Adrian was a fake. The doctor, an older man with absolutely no patience for a billionaire's temper tantrum, had simply pulled Brian's medical file from 20 years ago. It was a file from when Brian was in the hospital as a teenager for severe complications from his MS. I informed your parents back then, Mr. Thorne, the doctor said, adjusting his glasses. The damage was irreversible. You have never been capable of fathering children. We operated under the assumption that you knew. Brian walked blindly into the rain, his expensive Italian leather shoes splashing through puddles. He did not know. Or maybe, deep down, he had simply ignored the evidence. For 5 years, he put all the blame on Emma. Every single month, when she got her period, he would let out a sigh, give her a look of disappointment, and make a subtle remark about her biological clock ticking away. He had made her believe she was the one who was broken. He sent her to specialists, pressured her into taking hormones that made her physically ill, and shamed her when nothing worked. And all that time, he was the one who was broken. He flagged down a cab, his hands shaking. He had to get home. He had to explain things to Chloe. Chloe! The thought hit him like a ton of bricks. Chloe was only with him because he promised her everything. He promised her a dynasty. If she discovered he was infertile and that his entire company was on the brink of failure, she would be gone by morning. He walked into his penthouse soaking wet. The entire place was a disaster. Shopping bags were strewn everywhere. Chanel, Hermes, Prada. Chloe was on the sofa, surrounded by opened boxes, screaming into her phone. I do not care that the card was declined. Run it again. Do you have any idea who my boyfriend is? She looked up when Brian entered, dripping water onto the marble floor. Finally, Brian, you need to fix my black card. It is so embarrassing. Brian looked at her. He really, truly looked at her. Yes, she was beautiful, but it was a shallow, artificial kind of beauty. There was no kindness in her eyes, only greed. Chloe, he said, pack your bags. She laughed. A sharp and brittle sound. Excuse me? Are we going to Paris? No, Brian said, walking over and kicking a Chanel box clear across the room. You are leaving. Get out. Chloe jumped to her feet, her face contorting into a sneer. You cannot be serious. You actually think you can throw me out just like you did to your ex-wife? My ex-wife, Brian said, the words feeling like they were being ripped from his throat, was worth 10 of you. She built me up. You just bleed me dry. Get out, Chloe. I am done paying for your companionship. Fine, she shrieked, grabbing a handful of jewelry off the table. You are boring anyway. And for your information, Brian, everybody laughs at you. You think you are some kind of king, but you are just a walking ATM. And I heard all about the lawsuit. You're going to be a poor man, Brian, and being poor is not a good look for you. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard that the walls shook. Brian was alone. He poured himself a drink and stared out at the city lights. He had completely destroyed his marriage for a woman who did not love him at all. He had lost the only person who ever truly had faith in him. But then the sadness began to transform into something much darker. A cold, wicked anger began to bubble up. Emma knew. She must have known the whole time. If she was pregnant now and the baby was not his, and he was sterile, it could only mean she had cheated. The timeline gnawed at him. They had been divorced for 6 months, but she was 7 months pregnant. She had slept with another man while they were still married. Brian let out a low, manic laugh. The perfect Saint Emma, the woman who acted so pure. She was an adulteress. He grabbed his phone. He dialed a number he had not used in years, a slimy tabloid reporter named Barry, who owed him big time. Barry, Brian said, his voice dangerously smooth, I have a major scoop for you. The real story behind the romance of Adrian Vance and Emma Cross. How a billionaire stole another man's wife, and how Saint Emma was carrying another man's child while still sharing a bed with her husband. That is absolute gold, Brian, Barry said, practically drooling. But can you prove the timeline? The baby is the proof, Brian lied. Run the story. Destroy her reputation. If she wants to sue me for my company, I will make sure she is too ashamed to ever show her face in court. Brian hung up the phone. He felt a sick sense of satisfaction. If he was going down, he was dragging everyone else down with him. The headline the next morning was savage. Billionaire's baby scandal. Did Adrian Vance steal his pregnant mistress from a heartbroken husband? The article made Brian out to be the victim, a hard-working man, blindsided by a cheating wife who had seduced a richer man to climb the social ladder. It strongly suggested that the baby was the result of a secret affair that happened in Brian's own home. Brian sat in his office, watching the chaos unfold on social media. Public opinion was starting to swing in his favor. People were calling Emma a gold digger. They were starting to question Adrian's character. This will make them settle, Brian told Marcus Sterling, who looked incredibly pale. They will drop the lawsuit just to make all this bad press disappear. Brian Sterling said, looking down at his tablet. You need to see this. Vance Global just announced a press conference. They are streaming it live. Brian spun his chair around to face the giant screen on his wall. Adrian Vance was standing at a podium. He did not look nervous. He did not look angry. He looked like an executioner. Emma stood right next to him. She was not hiding. She looked straight into the camera, and her expression was fierce. This morning, Adrian began, his voice booming through the speakers. A desperate man tried to use the media to bully a pregnant woman. Brian Thorne has. He accused my fiancée of infidelity. He claimed I was the one who destroyed a happy home. Adrian paused, looking straight into the camera lens. We expected this because liars naturally assume that everyone else is a liar too. Adrienne moved aside, and Emma stepped up to the microphone. I was never unfaithful to Brian Thorne, she stated with absolute clarity. For 7 years, I was a devoted wife. I was his biggest supporter when we had absolutely nothing. I was the one who wrote the code that made him a billionaire, often while he was asleep. She held a document up for everyone to see. This is a medical report from the Mayo Clinic dated 8 months ago, which was 1 month before Brian filed for divorce. It confirms I went through a single round of in vitro fertilization treatment using a donor. Brian froze in his office. In vitro fertilization? I did this? Emma's voice trembled, but she continued. I did it because my husband was desperate for a child to carry on his name, but he refused to see a doctor about his own issues. I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted to give him the family he always said he dreamed of. I used my own personal savings to pay for it all. I gave myself the injections, all alone. A complete silence fell over the conference room, on the screen, and an even deeper one settled over Brian's office. I learned that the procedure had been successful on the very same day Brian served me with divorce papers, Emma said, as a single tear finally rolled down her cheek. I tried to tell him. He refused to listen. He just threw me out. I was pregnant, with no home, and completely on my own. That was when Adrian Vance found me. He didn't steal me from you, Brian. You threw me away. He simply picked up the treasure that you were too blind to see. Adrian stepped back to the microphone, and regarding the business, it seems Mr. Thorne has forgotten a key detail about the ghostwriter software architecture he stole from my client. Brian's stomach plunged. Emma didn't just write the original code, Adrian explained with a grim smile. She also protected it. There is a fail-safe program embedded deep in the system's core. You could call it a kill switch. It was designed to activate if an unauthorized user, meaning you, Brian, tried to alter the core files. And according to our logs, your information technology team did exactly that this morning, trying to cover up the evidence of your theft. Adrian glanced at his watch. The kill switch is set to activate in 3, 2, 1. In Brian's office, the overhead lights flickered once. Then the steady hum of the servers throughout the building went silent. Brian's computer monitor turned completely black. "Sir?" his assistant screamed as she burst into the room. "The platform is gone. The application is down. Everything is offline. The code, sir, it's just vanished. It is deleting itself from the servers." Brian slammed his fists on his keyboard in a panic. There was nothing. All he saw was a black screen with a small green cursor blinking in the corner. "Error. User unauthorized." "Goodbye, Brian." On the television screen, Adrian Vance leaned toward the microphone. Thorn Tech is now nothing more than a shell company with zero actual assets. Its stock is in a complete freefall as we speak. I have already contacted the Securities and Exchange Commission to provide them with evidence of Brian Thorne's embezzlement of company funds, which he used to pay for his mistress's extravagant lifestyle. Adrian's eyes were as cold as ice. Checkmate, Brian. The live feed ended. Brian just sat there in the deafening silence of his dead office. His phone started ringing. It was the board of directors, then a call from the Securities and Exchange Commission, then his bank. He did not answer any of them. He walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window and gazed down at the busy streets of Manhattan. He had always wanted to be a king. He had always wanted people to fear him. In a way, he got his wish. He was now feared, but only as a cautionary tale. He watched as a black sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb many stories below. He saw a small figure wearing a green coat get into the vehicle with help from a tall man. Even from that great distance, he could see the tenderness in the man's gesture. Emma. She had won. She didn't just beat him. She had completely erased him. Brian slowly sank to the floor. The silence of the abandoned office pressed down on him like a physical force. He reached into his pocket and took out an old, crumpled photograph he had carried in his wallet for years. It was a picture of him and Emma in their college dorm room, eating pizza on the floor and laughing. They had been broke. But he looked so happy. He finally understood, with the crushing weight of his total ruin, that in that single moment, he had been the richest man in the world, and he had traded it all for a diamond chandelier that was not even real. In the world of high-stakes business, 3 years is an eternity. In 3 years, new companies are born, massive empires collapse, and names that once filled the headlines are forgotten and swept away. But for Brian Thorne, 3 years felt like 300 years. His downfall had not been quick. It was not the clean, fast execution he might have hoped for when the screen in his office went dark. It was a slow, agonizing process of being taken apart piece by piece. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigation lasted for 18 long months, a public humiliation that stripped away every last piece of his dignity. First, they seized the penthouse apartment, then the luxury cars, and then the art collection. He clearly remembered the day the federal marshals came for his watch collection. He just stood there as a man in a cheap windbreaker handled his Patek Philippe, the one he bought after making his first $10 million, and tossed it into an evidence bag as if it were a child's plastic toy. That was the exact moment Chloe left him. She didn't even bother to pack a suitcase. She just ordered a rideshare, looked at him with eyes that held no trace of affection, and said, "You're bad for my brand, Brian." Now, 3 years later, Brian was shivering on a sidewalk on East Wacker Drive in Chicago. The wind coming off the lake was like a physical blow, a sharp, wet cold that cut right through the thin material of his polyester uniform. He was no longer Brian Thorne, the tech genius. He was just Jules, the lowest-ranking valet at the Grand Plaza Hotel. "Hey, Jules, wake up." The shout came from Manny, the 20-year-old valet captain who spent most of his shift vaping and scrolling through TikTok. Manny had no idea who Brian used to be. To Manny, Brian was just the quiet, gray-haired man who was not fast enough on the sprint to the cars and whose hands shook too much with the keys. "I'm awake," Brian mumbled, stomping his feet to try and bring some feeling back into his toes. His cheap black shoes were leaking. The icy slush from the street had soaked through his socks hours before. "It is a big night tonight," Manny said, blowing a cloud of strawberry-scented vapor right into Brian's face. "The Future of Tech Gala. We have very important people coming from everywhere." "Don't scratch a single thing, old man. These cars are worth more than your entire life." Brian flinched. The Future of Tech Gala. Just 5 years ago, he had been the keynote speaker at this very same event. He remembered the thunderous applause. He remembered the feeling of the spotlight, hot and blinding, as he lectured everyone about vision and disruption. He remembered Emma sitting in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking up at him with a pride he now knew he had never deserved. She had worn a simple blue dress that evening because he had told her the designer gown she really wanted was too flashy. Tonight, he was not the keynote speaker. He was just the help. The grand doors of the hotel swung open, spilling warm, golden light and the smooth sound of jazz onto the snowy pavement. The scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats drifted out, a cruel reminder of the hunger that was gnawing at Brian's stomach. He had skipped lunch just to save $5 for his electric bill. The guests began to emerge. Brian recognized some of the faces. There was Marcus Sterling, his old lawyer, sharing a laugh with a new client. Sterling looked directly at Brian without a hint of recognition as he handed him a ticket stub for a Mercedes. Brian took the ticket, his head held low, the brim of his cap pulled down to hide his eyes. He retrieved the car, accepted a $2 tip without saying a word, and watched Sterling speed away. This was a special kind of hell, being invisible in a world where you once felt like a god. "Heads up," Manny hissed, quickly straightening his jacket. "We have a high-profile guest arriving. Private car service. A blacked-out Escalade. That is Vance's security detail." "Vance?" The name shot through Brian like an electric current. The air caught in his throat. He had an overwhelming urge to run. He considered faking a medical emergency, hiding in the staff room, or just melting into the pavement. Anything, to not be in that spot. But he was completely paralyzed. His feet felt glued to the sidewalk, held in place by both pure terror and a strange, self-destructive need to see what happened next. The huge black sport utility vehicle glided to the curb, positioned between two security cars. It did not seem like an ordinary car. It was more like a moving vault. The engine produced a deep, strong hum that seemed to make Brian's bones vibrate. "Jules, open the door," Manny ordered, distracted by his conversation with a wealthy woman in a fur jacket. Brian moved forward on shaky legs. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to quickly clasp them behind his back to regain control. He walked toward the back passenger side door. He saw his own face reflected in the dark window, looking pale and thin, like a man he did not recognize. Man with gray stubble and haunted-looking eyes. He looked 20 years older than his actual age, of 35. He reached out his hand and pulled on the heavy handle. The door swung open, and a wave of warmth washed over him. He smelled leather, cedarwood, and jasmine. The very first thing he saw was a shoe. A perfectly polished, handmade Italian Oxford. Adrian Vance stepped out of the vehicle. Time had been very good to Adrian. If anything, the passing years had only enhanced his powerful presence. He looked broader, and his salt and pepper hair was cut in a sharp, military style. He moved with the effortless confidence of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He did not even glance at the valet. He turned back toward the car and extended a hand. "Careful, love. It is icy out here." A hand reached out and took his. It was a hand Brian knew better than his own. He knew the shape of every finger, the gentle curve of the wrist. He knew how that hand felt when it used to smooth his hair back whenever he was sick. He knew how it felt when it scrubbed dishes in their first tiny apartment together. Emma stepped out. Brian felt all the air rush out of his lungs. She looked magnificent. The timid mouse he once knew was gone. The woman standing in front of him now was a queen. She was wearing a floor-length gown made of deep crimson velvet that perfectly hugged her figure, topped with a white coat that looked like freshly fallen snow. Her hair was styled in loose, glamorous waves, and brilliant diamonds sparkled at her throat. They were not the large, flashy kind that Chloe used to demand, but elegant, timeless jewels. But it was not just the clothes that had changed her, it was her face. The lines of worry that had defined her during their marriage had vanished, replaced by a look of profound serenity that radiated from within, gave her a special kind of radiance. She looked so relaxed, so cherished. "Wait for me," a little voice piped up from inside the vehicle. Brian went completely still. A small boy, who couldn't have been more than 3, hurried to the edge of his seat. He was bundled in a tiny navy peacoat and a festive red scarf. He had dark, wavy hair and brilliant, curious eyes that seemed to absorb the entire world with fascination. Adrienne let out a deep, joyful laugh, the kind of laugh Brian had never once heard aimed in his direction. "We didn't forget you, Leo. Come on over here, champ." Adrienne scooped the child up with ease and set him right on his hip. The boy let out a happy giggle and wrapped his little arms around Adrienne's neck. "Did you see the robot, Daddy?" the boy asked with excitement. "The one that had lasers?" "I sure did," Adrienne answered, placing a kiss on the top of the boy's head. "But I have a feeling you enjoyed the dessert table a lot more." "I like cookies," Leo announced with great seriousness. Emma chuckled, gently wiping a snowflake from her son's nose. "You are 100% your father's son, a love for sweets and an obsession with lasers." Your father's son. Those words kept ringing in Brian's mind, echoing in the vast, empty space where his soul used to be. Your father's son. Leo was not Brian's child. He could never be Brian's child. The results of the DNA test had been the final blow to Brian's pride. He was infertile. He was a genetic dead end. All his grand speeches about his legacy, about building a dynasty, about the importance of the Thorne name, had all been a complete lie. The true legacy was standing right there before him, a cheerful, healthy kid being raised by a man who never had to demand respect to get it. Brian just stood there by the open car door, unable to move. He knew he was supposed to close it. He knew he needed to step away and disappear back into the background, but he found it impossible to tear his eyes away from the boy. Leo had Emma's nose. He had her same smile. Then all of a sudden, the boy turned and looked directly at him. Leo's gaze met Brian's. The child didn't see a broken man. He didn't see a bankrupt failure. He just saw a man wearing a silly hat, standing out in the snow. "Hi," Leo said, waving a hand covered in a mitten. The sound of that little boy's voice completely broke Brian's self-control. Tears stung his eyes, hot and immediate. He wanted to speak, to say hello back, but his throat felt like it had slammed shut. Emma turned her head. She followed her son's line of sight. Her gaze fell upon the valet. For a single moment, nothing changed. The snow continued to fall quietly all around them. The sounds of the city seemed to disappear, and then the realization hit her. It was not a dramatic moment. She did not gasp in shock. She did not clutch at her chest. Her eyes just widened, ever so slightly. She noticed the cheap uniform, the soaked shoes, the graying hair, and the name tag that said Jules. Brian prepared himself for the worst. He fully expected her to sneer. He expected her to start laughing. He expected her to nudge Adrian on the shoulder and say, "Look, honey, look at what the cat dragged in." He almost wished she would. He deserved her fury. Her anger would at least be a sign that he still meant something to her, even if it was negative. But Emma did not get angry. Instead, her entire expression softened. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. She looked at him with a deep, soul-crushing sadness. It was the kind of look you give a stray animal that has been hurt too many times to let anyone get close. It was pity. It was pure, detached pity. She never said his name. She gave no sign that they had a past together. She did not ask him how he had been. She simply turned her attention back to her husband and her son. "It is freezing out here, Adrian," she said in a soft voice. "We should get Leo inside the jet. He is starting to shiver." "You are right," Adrian replied. He then turned to Brian. Adrian had no idea who he was. To Adrian Vance, Brian Thorne was just a minor detail, a small obstacle from the very beginning of his life with Emma. He was so unimportant that he did not even seem familiar. "Excellent service," Adrian said. His tone was professional, but also warm. He reached inside his coat pocket and took out a folded bill. He pushed it firmly into Brian's hand. "Stay warm out here," Adrian added. Brian looked down at his hand. It was a brand new, crisp $100 bill. The face of Benjamin Franklin seemed to stare back, as if it was mocking him. "Thank you, sir," Brian managed to whisper. His voice was a weak, broken thing that he barely recognized as his own. Adrian gave a quick nod and turned his back, leading his family toward the private entrance of the hotel, where a car was waiting to take them to the airfield. "Bye-bye," Leo shouted from over Adrian's shoulder, waving his little mitten one more time. Brian lifted a trembling hand and gave a tiny, defeated wave in return. "Bye," he mouthed silently. He stood there and watched them go. He noticed Adrian bend down to whisper something in Emma's ear, and then he saw Emma rest her head on Adrian's shoulder. They moved together like a single entity, a solid, unbreakable unit of warmth and affection. They were a family, and Brian was nothing more than the man who held the door for them. The moment the heavy glass doors of the hotel swung shut behind them, blocking them from his view, the silence of the street came rushing back. The wind began to howl, whipping fiercely around the corner of the building. Brian stared down at the $100 bill in his hand. In his former life, he would have used a bill like this to light one of his cigars. He would have given a waitress this amount as a tip just for bringing him a glass of water. He would have scoffed at how meaningless it was. But now this single piece of paper meant the difference between having a meal and going hungry. It was the difference between having heat and freezing in the cold. He clutched the bill so tightly his knuckles went white. A sob started to build deep in his chest, a sharp, ragged thing that he could no longer hold back. He slumped back against the cold stone of the hotel's wall, sliding all the way down until he was crouched on the wet, snowy pavement. He had wasted his life building a fortress of wealth to keep everyone at a distance, foolishly thinking it made him powerful. He had viewed people as assets and liabilities, as things to be bought and sold. He had pushed away the one woman who had ever loved him for who he was. And he did it all because he wanted an image that would look good in a glossy magazine. He had desperately wanted to be a king, but now he finally understood the truth. Kings are really just men wearing fancy costumes. The real power was never in the crown. It was in the hand that you hold when the cold snow begins to fall. Emma had found a hand to hold. Brian had nothing but his own two hands deep in his pockets. "Hey, Jules!" Manny yelled from the valet booth, totally unaware of the broken man on the ground. "Stop counting your money. We have a Corolla coming in. Let's go." Brian used the rough sleeve of his coat to wipe his face. He drew in a long, shaky breath. The frigid air stung his lungs, which helped to bring him back to reality. "Coming?" he called out in a hoarse voice. He pulled himself to his feet. He tried to straighten out his cheap, oversized jacket. He took the $100 bill, the charity from his ex-wife's new husband, and put it in his pocket right next to his bus pass. He walked slowly toward the beat-up Corolla that was pulling up to the curb. He opened the door, put a fake smile on his face, and lowered his head. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza," Brian whispered. "How may I assist you?" And that, everyone, is the quiet, chilly end of the line for Brian Thorne. There was no big explosion, no dramatic fight in a jail cell, just the slow, freezing cold understanding that he was the one who had built his own prison of misery. He dedicated his life to chasing things that had a high price, but he never learned what had real worth. He tossed away a priceless diamond because he was distracted by something shiny, and by the time he understood his mistake, that diamond was already the centerpiece in another man's crown. It is a powerful lesson in what goes around, comes around. Sometimes the worst consequence is not what happens to you, but all the good things that will never happen for you. Brian did not get the family, he did not get the love, and he did not get the legacy. All he got was the tip. I really want to know what you think in the comments. That look Emma gave him, that look of pity. Do you believe that was more painful than if she had yelled and screamed at him? Is being ignored the most effective form of revenge? And if you were in Emma's shoes, would you have said anything at all? Or did she make the right choice by just walking away? Let us start a good discussion down below. If this story gave you chills, drop a comment below. Do you think Emma's silent pity hurt Brian more than if she had screamed at him? Is being completely forgotten the ultimate revenge? Hit that like button if you believe karma always finds its way back. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss another story where the underdog rises and the arrogant fall. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their worth is not defined by those who failed to see it. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and thought-provoking storytelling. Thank you for being part of our community.